Okay, so we were talking about what's blocking our inner light. So what's blocking our inner light? We all have this light that wants to shine. So how do we let it shine, and what's blocking it? So it all starts in the very beginning, in the book of Genesis, in Breshit, where you have Adam and Chava. And Adam and Chava have a tree in the garden with them. And they're told not to eat from the tree. And they eat from it. But before they ate from that tree, the verse tells us, Shnehem arumim v'lo yitbosheshu. The two of them were naked, but they were not embarrassed. So they did not have any clothing on. But as soon as they ate from that tree, the first thing they do is they rip off the leaves of the fig tree and make clothing for themselves. They cover themselves up. They have that sense, the need, the shame, the embarrassment. But this is what's so amazing. I've been teaching these verses for years. And when I say years, I mean years. I mean, we're talking like 25 years. It's unbelievable. And I never picked up on this fine point. So we said they make clothing for themselves. And then they go and hide. And then God says, Ayeka, where are you? And he knows where they are. But they're in hiding. He wanted to start a conversation, not to scare them before he gives them any type of punishment. And he says to them, did you eat from the tree that I told you not to eat from? And so man responds, listen to this, it's unbelievable. He responds and says, we were hiding because we were naked. Okay. Did we not just read in the previous verses that what? They made clothing. So what are you talking about that they're naked? They made clothing for themselves. So we have to understand, what does that mean to say that you're naked, but yet you have clothing on? Unbelievable thought. Then the verses continue. God then gives his punishment to them. And then at the very end of the story, it says that God makes them clothing. And not only does he make them clothing, he clothes them. He puts the clothing on them. And the commentators, Rashi specifically says, what was this clothing that God made? And it says there that he made clothing that was like fur, like my jacket that I'm wearing, like a little fur. Why a fur? Because fur is something cozy and warm. And I always like to explain it like it represents a hug from God. That God was trying to explain to Adam and Chava, to Adam and Eve, no matter what, I know you sinned. I know you did this not such good thing, but I love you no matter what. So this is a great story. A great story, a lot of lessons we can learn from it, especially the part that God is saying that he loves us no matter what. But I want to focus on the fact that Adam said that he was naked, but yet he had clothing on. So what was God giving him? Why was God clothing him when he already had clothing? And why is Adam saying he doesn't have clothing? So this is what we deal with on a daily basis. What is blocking our inner light? And so when we look at clothing, we could look at clothing on many different levels, and that's what we're going to go a little bit deeper on in a second. But clothing can become a barrier between us and God. Clothing can be a barrier between us and other people. Clothing can be a barrier for us to ourselves. It's very powerful. And so for the case of Adam and Eve, the clothing they put on was a figurative type of clothing. It was the shame, the embarrassment. It doesn't have to necessarily be this physical, real clothing, literally clothing. But God was trying to tell Adam and Eve, take that off, take that mask off, take those feelings of being judged, of a shame, embarrassment, take it off. Because only when we remove those barriers, when we remove those mental blockages, then the real light can shine through. Because the real light is going to come from God himself. It comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it comes from Hashem. And when we allow him to clothe us, and we allow his light to come within, that's what we're going to shine right out. So what's another example of clothing being a barrier? That would be the story of Rivka. Here's Rebecca. She comes from this family in Haran. Impurity left and right. She was a special girl. comes Abraham's servant, finds her, wants her to be the wife, and sees that she's the chosen one, that she's going to be the wife of Isaac, of Yitzchak, brings her back, and on their travels back, lo and behold, there's Isaac standing in the distance. Suach basadeh. He's there, praying in the field. She does not yet know that that is Isaac, her husband-to-be. She just sees this man, and she falls off her camel. She's just like shocked by his spirituality, this glow that he has, especially here's Rebecca coming from a home that she's not witnessing any spirituality whatsoever. And now she's coming across somebody that's so spiritual. She doesn't know what to do with herself. It's like it's as if pow, like a lightning bolt hits her and she falls right off of that camel. Then she says, who is that? She asks Eliezer, the servant, who is that? And he says, that's Isaac. That's your future husband. So the verse tells us, you know what she does on that very spot? She takes her tzi'if, her scarf, her veil, and she covers herself up. Now, a lot of times commentators like to say, oh, that's a form of modesty. She realized that that's her husband-to-be, and so she covers herself up. But there's another way to look at it. This tzi'if that she has, she clothes herself with it. She uses it as a barrier between her and her husband. She sees this man, this is going to be my husband. I've never been around somebody so spiritual before in my life. Oh my gosh, I'm not on his level. It can't be. So she puts up this barrier as if it's like a wall between her and her husband. And this wall stays intact throughout their relationship until the very end. Only the very, very end of our story. Another proof of this wall that's up is when they go and pray to have children. It's been 20 years and they don't have children. And Rashi explains that she prayed in one corner and he prayed in another corner. Opposite corners. There's a division between the two of them. Another example of this division is when she finally becomes pregnant and she has these babies, and there's this struggle in her belly. And she doesn't know what's going on. And so she goes to seek advice. And she's told that she has two nations in her belly. One is going to be serving God and one other gods. And she knows which one is which. And she knows which one is going to be on the right path. But she never, ever shares that information with Yitzchak. She doesn't tell him. And what ends up happening is that Yitzchak favors Esav and Rivka knows to favor Yaakov. And there are so many opportunities she could have told her husband, but she doesn't. Because there's this se'if. There's this constant barrier. Even when it comes to the time of the blessings. She could have easily just pulled her husband aside and said to him, oh, Esav, I had a meeting with the prophet some time ago, 63 years ago, and they told me that it's really Yaakov that's going to continue the line, not Esav. But she doesn't do that. Instead, she convinces her own son to clothe again, put on the clothing of Esav, and portray himself as Esav. So here you have another example of when clothing becomes this negative barrier. Another classic example of clothing representing something within the Torah is the me'il, a coat. Now, me'il in Tanakh always represents kingship. And the most famous coat that we all know about is Joseph's Technicolor, right? Dream coat from the Broadway show, the movies, right? This coat that Jacob makes for Joseph, for Yosef, it's more than just showing favoritism to Joseph. It's like a dig to the brothers because they know that that coat represents kingship. And that's like a stamp from their father saying, you know what? He's the next one in line. He's going to be the king. His children will be the king. And they didn't like that. They didn't like where this was going. They didn't like what Joseph represented. They didn't like the fact that the father saw him as the future king. And it was all starting from this coat. Clothing again. So here the clothing can represent royalty, but yet it was perceived in a different way. Another time you have an example of a coat representing royalty. That is with Shaul and David. Shaul is the first king. And unfortunately, he loses the right to be the king. And David is then the one that's chosen, but Shaul is still in power. And he knows that David is going to be the next one, and he's very upset, and he wants to kill him. And there's this whole chase going on between the two of them, to the point where, at one point in time, Shaul's in a cave, and David sneaks up and rips off the corner of his coat, symbolic of the fact that the kingship is no longer in your hands. He's able to rip it right off of him. So here you see how the coat, again, represents this kingship. I think probably one of the most beautiful portrayals of clothing is probably what clothing is really meant to do. Whereas with Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava, the clothing was a tool that represented a barrier that I put up between me and God. Rivka, when she used the clothing, it was a barrier that she put up between her and her husband. And unfortunately, I think with Joseph and with the examples of David and Shaul, that coat became more of a barrier for themselves and prevented their growth at certain times. But the ultimate synthesis, the ultimate combination of how clothing can be used in the proper way, I think, is with the Kohanim, the priests. Because the role of the Kohen in general is about learning to synthesize the spirituality and the physical. Even the Kohen himself, how do you become a Kohen? You're born into it. It's something physical. It's not something chosen. You are physically, through genetics, you become the Kohen. But the job of the Kohen is to bridge the physical world and the spiritual world. Let me give you a classic example. Moses is sent on a mission. God chooses him to go to Egypt and get the people out. He doesn't want to do it. He comes up with so many excuses. He says, I have a speech impediment. I can't go. Right? God says, I can make the blind see. I can make the deaf hear. What do you mean you can't go? So he says, okay. He gives another excuse, until finally he runs out of excuses and he just says to God, you know what? Just send whoever you want to send, but just don't let it be me. And God's not happy with that answer. And he says to him, you know what? Because you don't want to be the messenger now, you will lose the right to be the future messenger between me and the people. And who does he give that job to? He gives it to Aaron, his brother. He becomes the priest. He then becomes the high priest. Aaron's children become the priests. Because the role of a priest is to bridge the physical and the spiritual world. Something interesting that a lot of people don't know is that the Talmud explains that the first priest ever was Abraham, Avraham. But not as in the sense of being a Kohen as we know them today as the priests, but as the role of the Kohen, the role of the priest. What do we know that's so unique about Abraham? He was able to bridge the gap between God and people. He brought back the concept of monotheism. Every time somebody came to visit him, and we know that was his thing, was having guests, when they came to visit him, and people would say, my gosh, this is amazing, this food, everything. He says, don't thank me, thank God. He made as if God was a household name for everybody. It wasn't anymore, God is up there in the heavens and I can't relate to it. He made God well known that people could connect to. He was the connector. That is the role of the priest. And let's make it even stronger, make it that much stronger. When did he become this connector? As soon as he stepped foot into Erez Canaan, when he stepped foot into the land of Israel, he became the connector. At what age does that happen? It happened at age 75. Now, it's interesting that the text tells us his age, because it's not common to tell me somebody's age when they arrive at a certain location. You could tell me how old they were maybe when they got married, when they died, maybe how old they were when they had children. But to tell me how old somebody is when they arrived at a certain location, that's funny. That's unusual for the Torah to do that. So we need to ask, what is this number 75? What is its significance? And it has a very big significance. If you look at the word Kohen in Gematria, now Gematria, just for those people who don't know, Gematria is when each letter has a numerical value. And if you look at the word Kohen and its numerical value, if you guessed it right, it's 75. The Chaf is 20, the Hey is 5, the Nun is 50, 75. So when he took on this role of Kohen, he was 75. But I'm going to make it even stronger. The Maharal loves to talk about two specific numbers, 7 and 8. 7 always represents nature, Teva. There are 7 days of the week. There's the Shemitah cycle. This is already set. This is natural. 7 is always natural. There's a number that's above natural, that is above nature, and that is the number 8. That is why a boy is circumcised on the 8th day. So now if you take these two numbers, 7 and 8, what is the midpoint? What is the midpoint? Oh, thank you very much for adding that. If everyone sees the notation that Melchizedek had anointed Abraham as the priest. What is the midpoint between 7 and 8? 7.5. So the Maharal says 7.5 is like 75. That the role is to connect the 7 to the 8. The Kohen's job is to go back and forth. It's like oscillating between the two. Between the spiritual world, the spiritual realm, and the physical realm, the 7, the natural. And that's the job of the Kohen, to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, to be that messenger. So on the one hand, we have this Kohen, this priest, that is born into it. But yet what's also very interesting is that the garment of the priest, the garments of the priest, the begadim, also play a crucial role. And it's so out of the ordinary for us in our understanding of text. Like why all of a sudden their clothing, because clothing plays an important role. What's even more interesting, if you look at the word clothing, beged, could also come from boged, to like rebel. Because when clothing isn't used in its proper way, it could be as if a rebellion. It's a division. It's blocking the true clothing of God. But when it's used properly, if it's used, the me'il, to represent kingship, to represent royalty, then we're allowing God's inner light that he has for us, the light that is shining down on us, and then it could shine right back out of us. So our clothing plays such a big part and role in our lives. It could be something positive, it could be something negative. But again, it doesn't have to necessarily be the literal clothing, those literal garments. It could be our own emotions, our own mental blockages, like we had with Adam and Chava, with Adam and Eve. But the key point is that God is telling us that in that very beginning, that first story, he's telling us something very special. He's telling us, you and I, he's teaching the world that even when you sin, even when you do something wrong, I'm still going to be there not only to make the clothing for you, but to dress you. You know, there are 4 commandments in the Torah that God does himself 4 times. 4 out of 613. So obviously these 4 must be special. The first one is Malbish Aramim, that he clothes the naked. Another one, just saying them so you should know, not necessarily that it has to do with this class. Another one is Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. Another one is Menachem Avel, visiting someone and comforting someone who is in mourning. And the last one is Kivor Meitim, is burying the dead. But that very first one, God himself does it. He's Malbish Aramim. He clothes the naked. And what do we mean by naked? He clothes us. He's there to comfort us. You know, I once heard a powerful thought. Thank God I'm blessed that I have never sat Shiva. I've never mourned. But I have experienced seeing other people mourn. And one of the phrases we say when someone's in mourning, when we're leaving, is "Hamakom yinachem etchem b'toch sha'ar v'leitzon Yerushalayim." That we say, Hamakom, the place, should comfort you. And it's interesting, Makom, place, is another way of saying God. So what are we saying here? That God is going to comfort you. That's exactly what we're saying. That now you have a hole. There's a hole in your makom. There's a hole in the place. There's a hole within you. You've lost someone dear to you, and now there's a hole. And only one source can fill that hole. Only one source can clothe that hole, and that is God himself. By him showing his unconditional love, that's him clothing us. And I was so fortunate one time to have a story, and I've shared this story many times, so if you've heard it before, I'm sorry, but if not, I think you're going to love it, of when I was a teenager. And I remember I was in camp. I was about 16 years old, and I must have been walking around very sad. And my sister, my older sister, says, "Jordana, what's wrong? You seem so sad." And I said, I did things that I shouldn't have done. I wasn't always honest with mommy and daddy, and just this guilt is driving me crazy, right? It's just building up. And so she said to me, "Well, visiting day's coming. Why don't you go for a walk with daddy and have a talk with him and share with him what you're feeling?" I said, "Okay, fine." She says, "But go with daddy, not mommy." I'm like, "Okay, fine, I'll go with daddy." So I go for a walk. It's visiting day, and I go for a walk with my father, and I guess you would call it a DMC. Today's day and age, I have a DMC with my dad, a deep, meaningful conversation. And I tell him, "Dad, I feel very bad about certain things that I did within the past year, the year before." And I'm about to start telling him. He says, "Stop. Don't tell me anymore." I said, "What do you mean, stop?" Because I love you. I'm your father. You are my daughter. And I love you no matter what. I don't need to hear all the things that you did wrong, because I will always forgive you, because I'm your father and you're my daughter. And so that story stayed at the back of my mind. It was stored in my memory. And then I became a mother. And I remember with my oldest daughter, something had happened, but I didn't get angry. Maybe typically somebody else, maybe if another child did that to me, another person, maybe I would have gotten angry, but my own child, I wasn't going to get angry, because you know why? Because I loved her. I loved her unconditionally, and I still love her unconditionally. And whatever she does, I will always forgive her. Or my child, or my son, I will always love them no matter what. And I was sitting in a therapy session with my therapist so many years ago, talking about this, that my child did something, but I'm not angry. And she says, where does that come from? And then I remembered the story of my father. And I told her that whole story about when I was in camp. And she said to me, "Now, can you imagine your human father forgives you no matter what. He will always love you no matter what. How much more so your Father in heaven? How much more so your spiritual Father? How much more so he forgives us and loves us?" And I come back to that beginning story, that first story in chapter 3 in Genesis, because that's where it's rooted. That's where God is teaching us. Don't put up blockages for the light. That inner light that you and I both have is a godly light. And when we put up those blockages, and if we feel that sense of shame, we feel that sense of judgment, we feel that sense of disappointment that like Adam felt. And God said, "What are you doing? Where are you? Where are you holding?" And then at the very end, what does God do? He not only makes the clothing, but he clothes us. He gives us that big, furry hug of forgiveness. And that's how you let your inner light shine. When you let God in and let your own blockages away. Take that clothing, those negative clothing, those clothing like the Seif of Rivka, that blockage, that wall that we put up sometimes. And that wall could be a wall that we put up between us and God, like Adam. It could be a wall that we put up between us and another person in our human connections. Or the wall could be put up between us and ourselves. And that wall that we put up doesn't allow God's light to come in. And when it doesn't allow God's light to come in, the light cannot shine out from us. And it's so important because we want to try to be as much as we can like the priests. And the holiday that's coming up so soon is the holiday of the priests, the Chashmonaim of Hanukkah. And that's the whole goal, is to be priest-like. God says to us, Mamlecha Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh, we are a kingdom of Kohanim. The role of the Jewish people is to be a shining light to the world. That's the holiday of Hanukkah. To put our menorah by the window, to emphasize this glorious miracle, to give off whatever godly light we have. That's our role, especially in Hanukkah, especially in the month of Kislev. Now, Kislev, I'm sure many of you know this, that Kislev can be broken up into two different words, kis and lev. Kis being a pocket or kisui, a covering. That this is the month we're meant to uncover Lamed Vav. Some people say you're supposed to uncover the Lamed Vav tzaddikim, these 36 righteous people that we possibly could be, or the 36 candles that were meant to shine bright. Because without the shamish, you have 36 candles, the key core candles of the commandment of lighting that menorah. That this is our role. This is the month. This is what's so beautiful, to have this festival now, to be called the light of the infinite, because we are the light of the infinite. We are the light of God. But we need to remember that we have to uncover what's there. And in order to uncover what's there, sometimes we have to learn to accept and to receive from God. We have to accept that He's Malbish Aramim. We have to accept that He clothes us who are naked. He clothes us, but we have to learn to remove the barriers that we have within us, whether they might be physical barriers, mental barriers, emotional barriers. We have to learn to remove them and make those important connections in order to connect to God, to connect to one another, and to connect to ourselves. So I really hope you enjoyed this idea of what's blocking our inner light. And for those who've listened to it live, great. For those who are listening to the recap, amazing. Anyone that wants to give any feedback, I'm always available to listen and hear beautiful ideas, because I'm always ready to receive. And so thank you, Erez, for giving so many people this opportunity to share their light, whether it be through words of wisdom and Torah, through music, through poetry, through art. You're such a great connector and a true ambassador for the Jewish people, and really know how to play the role of a Kohen, of a priest. So thank you so much, and wishing everybody, whether a good night, good day, good morning, wherever you might be located. And have a happy and healthy Hanukkah.